We're going to jump in and have some fun with this conversation. I'm really excited that Alex is joining us today because I think he has a lot to offer in terms of just a unique perspective that not a lot of people do in the industry. Alex is coming to us, and I'm going to let him tell more about this, but he's coming to us as not only a vendor, but also as a property manager. He's got a foot in both camps, if you will. So he's got a lot of experience to offer and perspective that not many other vendors can necessarily offer. I think there's a lot of people who have started as PMs and made a transition into the vendor land, but not many who are doing it at the same time. And my understanding is that's describing you to the TOX. So we're going to jump in and just get to know you a little bit. Alex, tell us a little bit about you and what you do at RentEngine.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for having me, Benjamin and Chris. So I'm one of the co-founders and I'm the CEO of RentEngine. RentEngine is a end-to-end leasing platform for scattered site property managers, managing their marketing, lead response, showings, scheduling, reporting, application processing. It's a layer of AI in terms of responding to the leads. There's a heavy suite of kind of intelligence, both on your side to track how your team's performing, how your portfolio is doing, but then also for your owners as well, and really bringing all the different moving pieces of leasing, including communication, calling, and texting, into one very simple, easy to use, powerful platform.
Amazing. I love it. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I believe you're also an active property manager. So tell
Yeah,
us about your property management portfolio.
that's right. So got into this business from the property management side, started a company called Threshold Management in South Florida just around 2 years ago. We're at about 120 doors right now, combination of single family and small multifamily. And it was through Threshold Management that my co-founder and I came up with the idea of RentEngine, built a prototype, got it working for ourselves, and then kind of that began to grew. We shared it with other nearby property managers, and since then has become a main focus for us. But I've actually been in the property management world almost my whole life, working for my parents' company since I was probably 12, plunging toilets, showing apartments, doing marketing, even a little bit of bookkeeping. So you could say it's pretty much the only thing that I've ever known, and this is just an extension of that.
I love it. Now, I'm curious, there always seems to be some type of origin story on businesses coming out of nothing, right? Obviously, we've got a little bit of your origin story already with a background in property management, creating your own business in property management. That all makes sense. But I am curious about the coming to be of RentEngine. So tell us a little bit about the origin story there. What were some of the things that caused you to have this idea and kind of go into this direction?
Yeah, it wasn't our intention to build this from the get-go. And actually, we were Show Mojo customers for quite a few months in the early days of Threshold. What we wanted to do was pretty simple. We realized that to grow as a company, we needed to bring in more doors, but we had a bottleneck of showings and leasing. I think a lot of property managers can empathize with the new customers you tend to bring on tend to be vacant properties. And so leasing tends to be a big chunk of new business coming in. That's the situation that we found ourselves in those early days of Threshold. We wanted to find a way to scale that up. The kind of the product on the shelf, like I mentioned, didn't really cut it for us. We wanted a little bit more customization. We wanted better ease of use. Ultimately, we wanted to build a model focused around speed of leasing. And so abstracting it away from the software and really what are the results that come out of the software in terms of faster leasing, better team performance. And so we built a very early version for ourselves. Again, at this point, no intention of commercializing it, bringing it out to anybody else. My co-founder is highly technical. I'm a little bit technical. We got something working for us. This allowed us to then begin to kind of do remote showings across the Miami area. For those of you familiar with Miami, it's not necessarily the biggest city in the world, but when you factor in traffic, you're looking at an hour plus between kind of the north side and the south side. And so we started to kind of ramp this up, realize, okay, we could scale these remote showings. Okay, then we needed to add on the intelligence layer, the reporting layer. Okay, now we have other people joining the team. And over time, probably over the course of about 6 months, it grew into kind of the seed of a platform. And at that point, we said, look, there's a couple other property managers around here. They focus on different neighborhoods or different segments. Let's share it with them, get their feedback. Had fairly good feedback, but also a lot of kind of fixes and iterations to make as we worked with those early customers. And then from there, we said, all right, let's spread this to other Florida property managers. I know, Benjamin, you and I have a mutual kind of client in one of those who was an early adopter of RentEngine. And since then, we've kind of pushed across the United States. And I would say our main emphasis, look, our North Star is leasing speed and conversion rates. It's how much are we actually moving the needle for the property managers we work with? How many more leads are they generating? How are they turning more of those into completed showings and submitted applications? And I think that's the DNA that we bring with us as current property managers.
I love it. So if I'm hearing correctly, it really sounds like you're taking a very data-driven approach to trying to solve these problems. And maybe that's what was missing in the marketplace, or the problem that you were trying to solve.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the corollary that we use and we talk about internally is e-commerce. And we see leasing becoming more and more like e-commerce, especially in the markets where many of the properties for rent are very similar to the other ones in price, in terms of price, amenities. Maybe it's a new construction development and every property is pretty much the same, 3 bed, 2.5 bath. And what we found is some of the tactics and strategies that work in e-commerce would work very well in leasing. Among those is, yes, focusing heavily on data and how can you continue to push high conversion rates across your e-commerce website. That would be traffic coming in. So what's the experience like to convert that? And the other piece that's unique about leasing that e-commerce doesn't have is in e-commerce, you go, you see what you like, you click the button and buy it. In leasing, there is a conversation piece. And what we found was kind of the missing piece there was speed to response, both from the initial inquiry, but then also from kind of future questions that the prospect has. And what we found a very strong correlation in even in the early days as we were building this ourselves was the faster you can respond to a lead's question, they're significantly more likely to convert to the next step. And that holds true pretty much any stage of the leasing journey. And so taking that data approach, very nice kind of user interface design for the prospect where they do interact in terms of the unit info or the scheduling flow, and then having that really key obsession in terms of responsiveness and a great response experience fills up the leasing funnel very quickly and kind of we can continue to pull from those best in class e-commerce strategies as both markets evolve.
Super interesting. And I love the correlation between e-commerce and leasing. I think that's really smart. And it taps into the truism that you're selling to consumers, right? When you are renting. This is not a business to business transaction, it's a B2C relationship. And so tailoring your product to be consumer friendly is incredibly important. Now, I think it's interesting. I was talking about this with a friend recently, how in this world of developing businesses and AI and lots of amazing technologies, there's kind of these two competing viewpoints, if you will. We have the consumer mindset where we want speed of service, speed of data, speed of access, right? Oftentimes it's just about convenience and accessibility. Where on the other side of the property management business, we have owners and investors who are looking for a much more relationally based type of engagement. I'm curious, has that been your experience? Do you have any observations about that you can share with the folks who are viewing?
Yeah, and I would actually take this back to the property management company that we run. And we've been very intentional. There is no automation, there is no AI, there's nothing of that sort when it comes to the relationship that we have with our owners. Even from the first touch point in as a new owner lead, that's purely by phone call. Somewhere where we actually differentiate ourselves early on to gain a stake in the market was responding to new leads immediately. And like we actually built a little bot, my co-founder built a little bot that as soon as that lead came in, it automatically called all of our phones at the same time. And the first one of us who answered it got connected with the new lead who was inbound. And what we found was that creates an amazing lead experience because when that owner lead comes in, they're clearly requesting info on property management. If we can call them straight away, help answer their questions, see if this is even a good fit, and then schedule the next step, created a pretty delightful experience for the owner. But then they also took that kind of feeling as like, okay, this is the way that they're going to treat the leads that come in too. This is the way they're going to treat me when I call in later with potentially an accounting question or the need to acquire a new property through them. And so I completely agree that we really should, like, at least my point of view is we should kind of keep the automation out of the owner relationship. They're trusting us with their most valuable asset, and we should absolutely make the time and provide them the best quality personal service. On the flip side, I think that's the fastest way for a property manager to burn themselves out if they try to take a hands-on, non-stop approach the way we did there with every renter lead that comes in. And as we'll see this in the report that comes out, or leasing report that comes out later this month, but the average property gets over 30 leads before it rents. And if you try to call each of those, follow up with each of those manually across a portfolio of 10, 15, 20 vacancies, you'll be looking for another job very soon. And so what we found is that's the right place to kind of apply the automation, provide that first, second touch point through AI and automation, but then where the property manager wants to jump in, or if there's a specifically unique or high-end property that makes more sense for a human touch, they can do that.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, the official subject of our conversation for today was standard operating procedures, although we've gone on some cool tangents already. And Alex, I'm curious, as someone who has been in leadership and development of two businesses now, really to hear some of your observations and experiences around standard operating procedures. But what I'd really like to tap into, and what's something that we're really passionate about at Processes Made Simple, is seeing the opportunity across businesses, right? One of the things that we talk a lot about is how organizations are organizations everywhere, right?
Hmm.
Familial organizations, business organizations, charitable organizations, all these different kinds of organizations. And each of them need processes in their own way. So I'm really curious to hear any observations that you can share with us about kind of standard operating procedure differences between your two businesses that you're involved in. Granted, they're both for-profit enterprises, but they are
Hmm.
in completely different lines of service. And can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like from the business development side as you're putting together your SOPs?
Yeah. So I think it comes down to the kind of core kind of culture of each of the businesses and core focus. And the way I'll position that is in our property management business, the focus there is around delivering a best in class service to our owners profitably for both us and the owners and having a very high touch experience. But the business itself isn't particular isn't particularly innovative. We're not changing things here and there. We're not shipping new products specific to that business. We're building the best property management business we can in South Florida. But I think that's a fairly different ethos to kind of the software product focused company we have in RentEngine, where our whole focus there is kind of finding the right kind of innovation, getting it into the customer's hands and continuing to iterate and push the needle forward for each of our customers. So that approach kind of defines how we think about SOPs in each of the companies. And I would say the SOPs are significantly more rigid within the property management company, and they should be because in most cases, a property that's for rent is going to look fairly similar to another property nearby that you have in the portfolio that's for rent, and the way you treat them should be the same. And your team should expect a similar level of kind of service for all of them, the way your owners do. In RentEngine, to be honest, we don't really think about it in terms of SOPs. We think about it in terms of functional areas and how do we find the best people to run each of those functional areas and more set kind of a general mission for them. And if it makes sense, also some kind of quantitative metrics. But what we see in RentEngine is our focus is around creativity, getting new products out as quickly and as best as we can. And that kind of energy and momentum is more the focus of the company as opposed to kind of SOPs being the core and focus of the company.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to understand this a little bit more, but I
Yeah.
definitely understand at some level where you're coming from. One of the things that I've observed in my own business is that as a younger business, we're very much in a growth mode, right? And I see most businesses are one of two places. They're either in a growth mode or a stability mode, right? We've either got big problems that need to be solved in order for us to keep the doors open, or the doors are open and we're just pouring on the gas so that we can make it to next year or the next quarter or whatever the mile marker is. And it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the property management business is more of a stability business, if you will, whereas in the software business, you'd see it as more of a growth business. Is that fair?
That's a great designation. I really like that. And that would be true for both of our businesses. Yes. Property management is the stability business, and then RentEngine is a growth business.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. Well, let's talk a little bit more about property management
Yeah.
processes. So, again, Processes Made Simple is kind of founded with this idea of making processes more accessible and understandable for property managers and their teams. And we talk a lot about documenting processes and building processes and implementing processes and all the things about process, right? But I'm curious to hear your perspective as someone who is in the industry and also, again, is able to take that vendor perspective. What are some things that you observe, both with your own experience in property management, but also that you see in your clients, that most property managers get wrong when it comes to their processes?
What I generally tend to see is that the processes have to go through a level of evolution, right? They have to be battle tested. And so you can build a great process, but it has to meet the asphalt and see if this is going to fit right. And where I see that breaking down is when property managers are typically too rigid with their process. And so they set a process, but they don't give enough room to the process to adjust. And typically this, depending on kind of what function it is, 2 to 4 weeks of time to see enough kind of data and situations come through where you can adjust that process because it can lead to a couple of things. You can have an overly rigid process that creates kind of too many steps and layers that slows down the team, that's kind of tedious for the person doing it. You can also have one that tends to be too open, too many things get missed. And so I think That kind of 2 to 4 weeks after kind of designing the process as you start to implement it is critical to kind of review and say, okay, how does this process that we designed fit with what we built? Where do the adjustments need to be made? And I think that will tend to kind of provide the most opportunity for learning and opportunity for changes in those 2 to 4 weeks while the design is still fresh in your head, but you've started to see the data from implementation. And the other piece would be it's important to build teams do change, but I think it is important to build the process somewhat around the team you have in place because you may have a rock star, for example, you may have a rock star maintenance coordinator who really can do a lot more than the average maintenance coordinator. And for them, the process, you maybe don't want an overly rigid process because you want to give them the opportunity to iterate, bring in new ideas, have a bit more control over the process, and also it'll provide a better kind of more dynamic job experience for them. So I think the other piece would be making sure your processes fit with the type of person that's in a role, especially when it comes to those leadership positions, those people who are ultimately responsible for it. And then the other piece is if it's a person who's like, as a person changes through the organization, somebody leaves, it's a good time to reconsider how does the SOP for that functional area for that person match the new person that we've hired in the role.
Okay,
So
so you said a ton
to
of
sum it
stuff
up,
there.
having some
It was
play within the SOPs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was amazing. It's a lot of good advice there. But I want to pull out something specific here that I think was really key that you mentioned, and also kind of add my own twist on it here. You talked about how processes can be designed around the team, which I really like. But I think one of the things that you have to look out for here is making a process too customized to individuals, right? And that's certainly a danger zone. So what we talk about here at Black Sheep is kind of culture of the company is what begets your policy, and then your policy begets your process. And so often we start with processes and we just work there because it's operational and it needs to be done and it puts out the fires in the business. But it doesn't necessarily, they're not intentionally designed, right? If your policies are governed by your process, then that's going to be a mess, right? All of the situations that arise may help you develop your process or your policies, which definitely is an important thing to do. But I think in that ideal scenario, you're able to kind of sit down and think about your culture and your values first, then figure out what your policies are, and then get into your process. Now, that's the ideal. And I think the reality is that everyone on this call is currently in a business that is operating today, and not all of those
Mhm.
pieces are perfectly defined. So my question to you, Alex, is for those who are in the midst of things, what would be your advice about how they can back up and kind of go through a right approach to developing processes wisely in their business?
I think I would always start with the part of the business that needs it most and work backwards. Where is the stress area right now in manufacturing? That's what I think they usually call the bottleneck. Where are we backed up? In those early days of Threshold, our management company, that was leasing. We were backed up with a lot of leasing because all the new clients that we were bringing on were tended to be vacant. As you get more mature, that might be in an accounting function area and a maintenance function area. And I would say go as deep as you can within that one function area that needs the most change that's probably keeping you as the business owner up at night, and really over the course of a couple of weeks iterate on what that right process looks like and start. I think it is important to start with the type of people that are there, and I'm a big believer that kind of the person you hire is kind of the job that you end up kind of having, the team that you end up having. um, and so, depending on the personality and the type of person who's in the role, work with them closely to build out what that process looks like, get them to kind of bring in their feedback. But what I find is valuable as you're thinking about that is you, as the business owner, know what you want to be done. You have an idea of how you think it should be done. And I think a good starting point always is once you've spent some time in that function area figuring out what needs to change and be improved, you by yourself as the business owner sketch out that process and design it and work with somebody like yourself, Benjamin, who's kind of a process expert to give a general kind of sense of, okay, I think this is what the process looks like. It should be these steps. This is how we should think about it in your perfect world. And then bring it to kind of the team that you're working with that's in that functional area and have them kind of nitpick it with, hey, we have these situations. You haven't considered that. Hey, I think this would be better. But I think it's always good for the business owner, with whom ultimately the buck stops, to have a very strong perspective on what they want to see and then bring it to the team for kind of adaptations, tweaking, and implementation.
Yeah, love it. Thanks, Alex. I'll just throw a little bit of a plug in here, a reminder for anybody who's listening. In Processes Made Simple, we have a free documentation on how to put your processes on paper, and a whole bunch of templates that you can use to jumpstart your process documentation journey. So if you haven't viewed that before, definitely head to our website, processesmadesimple.io, and you can sign up and get all the details there. One other thing that you mentioned, Alex, that I thought was really astute here and interesting in terms of a cross-business approach is you talked about launching processes and then reviewing them 2 to 4 weeks later. And I really like that idea. And I think that concept is a very software-esque way of doing things. Very common in a SaaS space is like, okay, let's launch our product and then collect our feedback, and then we go back and we make revisions. We pass everything back to the developers, and we kind of create feedback loops within our various workflows so that there can always be a way to improve the product over time. But in property management, it's not necessarily such a tangible product, right? It's much more of a service. So what are some ways that property managers can create similar feedback loops within their business?
So I think this goes back to the almost the automation versus manual conversation we were having a little bit earlier. And the more you automate, the less visibility you tend to have in terms of how the process is actually being received on the front. And especially short of kind of having a data science person or somebody dedicated to combing through the kind of the automatic data. It's more, I think, especially in property management, it's a pulse business. And again, it also comes back to having the right people in the role. But if you have the right people in the role, they'll be able to give you a much better perspective just based on, I almost want to say, the vibes that they're getting from their counterparty. So if that's maintenance, that's kind of the tenants they're coordinating with, or if that's leasing, that's going to be the prospects they're dealing with, or if that's kind of on the owner relationship side, the owners. They, I think, can give you the best insight of what's going on. And so if you brought in the best people who take their job seriously, I would empower them to really kind of understand what is the vibe, what is the feeling on the street of this new change that we've made? Is it working? And to ask proactive questions to those counterparties. Say, hey, we just made this change. How has this impacted you? Is this in the right direction, the wrong direction? Because ultimately, property managers serve the owners first. In my opinion, the owners first, the tenants second. So that's, I think, also a good place to start as well. How has this impacted the owners? Okay, how has this impacted our tenants?
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's that idea of fiduciary versus contractual relationships. You really do have to place that owner interest first, while you also need to honor the relationship that you have with your
Yeah.
tenant, but the owner still sits in that fiduciary first place. So it makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about software and standard operating procedures. When we're thinking about the property management business, the operational
Hmm.
portion of the business, what we've observed is there's usually 13-ish, sometimes more, sometimes less, key processes that really sit in that operational space. And in many cases, a business can be, you can have all of these different pieces of the business in place. They could be working. You may have people who are performing these functions, but in many cases, they're done inefficiently. There's poor reporting, there's no accountability. There can be all kinds of issues, even if the business is working. So, how would you speak to a property manager who might be in that scenario where they know things aren't perfect and they want to get to what they think is the perfection, which maybe is highly automated, lots of software, things happening in the background, maybe in that idealist scenario, or has that big visionary perspective? How would you speak to that person and kind of give them a vision for the future while, kind of inspiring them, but also giving them a reality check, if you will?
Yeah. Well, so even though I run a software company, especially in property management, it always comes down to people. And my perspective here is the software gets you very far and adds an insane amount of leverage. But at the end of the day, in each of those areas you mentioned, Benjamin, the buck stops with somebody. It's the leasing manager, it's the maintenance coordinator, it's the COO, whoever it may be. The buck ultimately stops with them, and software is giving them and their team just a whole lot more leverage. So the first thing I would suggest is the person who's in that role the right person? Is the person who's responsible for that area, one of those 13 areas you mentioned, the right person? And what I mean by that is truly, are they coachable and are they motivated? Now, to me, those are the two most important metrics. Everything else can be taught if they're coachable and motivated. If the answer to that is no, I think it's probably time to kind of change that person or start to begin to change that person before you design the process. I think the worst thing you could do is design a process around a person that you're on the fence about and kind of lukewarm on, because that new person will come in, they may bring a different energy, a different flair, and you'll want to adapt that process to them. So I would say who is the person for that area where the buck stops, and are they the right person in the role? And if they're the right person in the role, then I would bring it back to you as the owner, especially for small and medium-sized businesses like property management companies. You probably have a fairly strong perspective on what the ideal outcome looks like. And maybe you as the business owner are hyper focused on your most important thing is profitability, or your most important thing is growth, or your most important thing is kind of client satisfaction. Whatever truly deep down is most important to you, you're going to orient the process thinking around that. And so once you have that kind of you have the person in place that you want, and you have the North Star in place, I would then build that ideal software from the that ideal process from the owner's perspective, like we talked about. And once you have that sketch, let's call it a sketch that they've worked together with themselves and with you on, then start to think, where can software help with this? And oftentimes where you see repeatability is where software can help. Okay, we're doing the same activity over and over again, probably multiple times a day. What are the software options that can help us with that? Or we're generating these reports over and they're all fairly the same. Where can we get software for that? And that's software to me is one of the last pieces to think about. And I would never recommend a property management company kind of build a process around a single piece of functional software. Even a software like RentEngine, it's great, but you should know how you want your leasing to look before you kind of come to implement RentEngine.
Yeah, love it. Okay, guys, we're going to start wrapping this up. So this is just your notification to think of questions. If you have questions that you want to ask Alex, feel free to consider those and drop them in the chat. But before we go on to any Q&A, Alex, I've got a couple of additional questions here for you. Number one,
Sure.
for anyone who is considering leasing software like RentEngine, what are some of the things that you would say need to be true in the property management business before they start working on leasing automations?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, Benjamin,
Okay.
but the person that you have that's on the front lines of leasing, and whether that's your leasing manager, but also flowing down to kind of your leasing agents and your showing agents, are they the right people? And especially as you're considering a software upgrade, like switching to RentEngine, are they the type of people that can kind of adapt to new software and kind of make that change, or are they going to be resistant and push against every step of the way? Because that'll kind of indicate if they're on the same wavelength as you as the business owner, or if they're going to kind of create a fight at every turn. So that would be the first thing: is do you have the right people in place that can kind of grow with your company and also grow with the changes that you make and the upgrades you make in software? And the other piece I would say is RentEngine sits at the leasing layer, and so that's everything from marketing all the way through kind of application review and processing. Where we kind of don't sit is the front end, which is make readies and turnovers, and then the back end, which is kind of turning an approved application into a lease. And so for RentEngine, to get the most benefit out of RentEngine, I would make sure that you have the processes on either side really dialed in as well. So that make ready turnover process, and then also that kind of application to lease move in.
Okay, makes sense. All right, final question for me. What is one piece of advice you would give to any property manager who is trying to go from a chaotic business to clarity and focus in this year of 2025?
I attended Broker Owner as an attendee last year, and there was a really good talk around metrics. And there was a metric that I heard, and it stuck with me, and that was potential management revenue. How many doors do you manage multiplied by the management fee of the rent? What I liked about that metric is that gave me a very good indication of how well are we growing the business, and kind of threshold is in the growth stage of a property management company. And so I made that the North Star metric for our company. And so I think the best thing a property manager can do if they're trying to wade through the chaos is really sit down and think with their colleagues and themselves, what is the North Star metric, the thing that I want to accomplish kind of by the end of the year, and really force yourself to put it into one number. And that metric will change year on year as you get into different stages of the business. But I find you'll have a lot more clarity if you pick one specific metric with one specific number and goal in mind and orient everything around feeding towards that.
I love it. Yeah, that aligns with so many different things. So yeah, love this is a fantastic spot for us to bring things to a close. Alex, really appreciate you being here. Before we end our conversation for today, as mentioned, I'll open it up for a little bit of Q&A. Guys, this is a chance to hit Alex with any tough questions that you have about really anything that you want, but we're specifically talking about property management and leasing automations. If you have questions about Alex's product, now's a great time to bring them in as well. And of course, we'll provide details on where you can find out more, as well as the link there in the chat. Thank you for that, Chris. So, any questions from any of our attendees for today? feel free to just drop them in the chat and we will address. Let's see. All right. Well, doesn't look like we have any questions for today. So, Alex, where can the folks who are listening find out more about you and what you're doing with RentEngine?
Definitely just go ahead and Google or go to rentengine.io, check out the platform. You can also schedule some time for a demo and see what it looks like up close and personal.
Sweet. All right. Oh, we've got a question here. Oh, sorry, a comment from Robert. Yes, the launching the process and reviewing later on. Absolutely love that. Glad you called that one out, Robert. That's definitely a big deal. And Alex, appreciate you mentioning that. Really a fantastic idea. All right, guys. Well, we're going to wrap things up for today.